Henry of Lancaster, Henry Bolingbroke, had deposed his cousin Richard II in 1399 to become Henry IV. The thrones of his son and grandson, Henry V and VI, rested on that shaky foundation, which crumbled in the Wars of the Roses when the true heirs to the throne, the House of York, began to battle for their inheritance. Owen Tudor stood squarely with the Henrys, the Lancastrians. That, after all, was where he had invested all his hopes. He fought for them, and in 1461 died for them, beheaded by Yorkists in Hereford Marketplace.
He was the last Tudor to lose his head. But as we all know, the Tudors would take up this approach to problem-solving themselves, you might say, with a vengeance.
Edward of York seized the throne, Edward IV, and Owen's 4-year-old grandson, Henry Tudor, began what would be decades of living on the run or as a refugee. But 3 years later, King Edward did something that would eventually give Henry Tudor everything Owen had wished for. He fell in love, and that began a chain of events which altered all England's history. When Edward was about 20, he was waylaid by an attractive widow of about 25 who was trying to recover her late husband's property. Edward, 6'3" tall and really very good-looking, wanted to help, and he became besotted. It seems she persuaded him to secretly enter into a contract to marry her. Her name was Eleanor Butler. About a year later, in 1464, another attractive widow, 26 years old, pulled the same stunt, and Edward did it again. Unbelievable! This time the lady was called Elizabeth Woodville, and this time it wasn't just a contract to marry, it was a full marriage to a commoner. When Elizabeth Woodville was crowned in Westminster Abbey, the whole of Europe was scandalized. Marriage was all about alliances of power and property. Marrying a penniless woman for love was simply disgusting. The negotiators trying to arrange a proper royal marriage were humiliated. And when Edward heaped honours, wealth and titles on Elizabeth's relatives, the Rivers family, the nobility of England were outraged. They were, quite frankly, getting completely above themselves. If anyone had known about Edward's promise to marry Eleanor Butler, things would have been even worse. But she was quietly shut up in a convent and died in 1468. As it was, Edward lost so much support that in 1470 he was actually driven out of England, and Henry VI came back to the throne. A few months later, Edward came back into London and regained the crown, thanks to the strong support of London merchants to whom he owed money, and even more, it was said, of their wives and daughters, who really seemed to have found him romantically interesting. Which, face it, Henry VI certainly wasn't, unless you fancied an elderly saintly scholar who'd lost his mind. In the battles that followed, Henry's son, another Edward, was killed, and King Henry himself, captured, disappeared into a prison and was never seen again. The whole male line of the House of Lancaster, the descendants of the sons of John of Gaunt, was now extinct. Except for one fragile thread, Margaret Beaufort and her 15-year-old son Henry Tudor. Not that they had any claim to the crown. Of course, the Lancaster dynasty had begun by simply usurping the throne, but on top of that, Margaret's grandfather was illegitimate. A law had been passed to make him legitimate, but it also barred him and his descendants from the succession. And that would probably have been that, if it hadn't have been for Edward's little secret, which didn't emerge until Edward himself was dead. He was only 41 when he fell ill and died. His son, the Prince of Wales, also called Edward, was just 12 years old.